There is a word the public kept reaching for, long before the scandals, whenever they tried to describe Prince Andrew. Not disgraced, that came later. Not troubled, not flawed. The word was entitled. It surfaced in newspaper columns, in dinner table arguments, in the comment sections of royal coverage years before Jeffrey Epstein's name entered the picture. Something in the way the Duke of York carried himself, the certainty of protection, the assumption that scrutiny was a problem reserved for smaller people. The watching public identified and named it long before they could prove it. They also had a theory about where it came from. On this channel's coverage of the Queen Mother, the most liked comment on the top-performing video reads, "Andrew took after his grandmother, rude, entitled, and living off the monarchy." On a video about Prince Philip, another viewer wrote, "No wonder Andrew inherited the morals of an alley cat." These aren't fringe observations. They represent the settled conclusion of an audience that has watched this family for decades. The through line from grandmother to grandson is the audience's own idea, assembled independently, written in comment sections, reinforced every time a new piece of evidence surfaces. That argument is interpretive, not documented. No biography traces a straight line from the Queen Mother's character to Andrew's. What exists is a pattern of parallel behavior across 70 years that is difficult to dismiss once you see it clearly assembled. The same conviction that bills would be met, the same resistance to consequence, the same institutional protection until the institution encountered a scandal it had no capacity to absorb. This is that story. It starts at the beginning of the 20th century and ends in a New York federal court. At its center is a BBC interview, broadcast on 16th of November 2019, in which a man trained his entire life to believe he was protected sat in front of a camera and discovered, in 58 minutes of live television, that he wasn't. Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon was born on 4th August 1900, the ninth of 10 children of the Earl of Strathmore. She didn't expect to be queen. The crown arrived sideways. By abdication, Edward VIII left in December 1936, and the quieter brother became George I, and his wife became the woman the century would decide to love. She was 36 when the transformation happened. The life that followed was built on assumptions the position made structural. If you have watched this channel's work on the Queen Mother, you know the broad outlines of how she handled money and limits across her long widowhood. What matters for this story are the specifics the biographers have put on record, because they are the template for everything that follows. George VI died in his sleep at Sandringham on 6 February 1952. His daughter became queen. The new monarch and Prince Philip moved from Clarence House to Buckingham Palace, and the Queen Mother moved into Clarence House, where she would remain for the next 50 years, occupying a residence the next generation had vacated for her. She also kept Birk Hall on the Balmoral estate, her retreat in Aberdeenshire, where she and George had spent summers. In 1953, she purchased Castle of May in Caithness, the northernmost inhabited castle in mainland Britain, and had its crumbling walls restored at considerable expense. There was Royal Lodge in Windsor, Great Park as well, the 30-room house in which she and George had once raised their daughters. 4 properties, each one staffed, each one heated and maintained across half a century of widowhood that outlasted almost everyone who had known the original arrangement. William Shawcross, the Queen Mother's official biographer with full access to her personal letters and the royal archives, described her relationship with money in terms that politely refused to call it a problem. It was simply there to be spent. Lavish hospitality was understood not as self-indulgence but as royal duty, the performance of monarchy's continuing vitality, the projection of confidence that happened to cost a great deal. Hugo Vickers, who wrote a separate authorized access biography with comparable sources, was more pointed. She had no real understanding of money, he wrote, delegating every financial matter and living as though resources had no ceiling. Both biographers recorded the same institutional dynamic. When palace officials attempted to impose limits on her expenditure, she was resistant. The expectation, entrenched across decades, built into the daily functioning of the household, was that the bills would simply be met. Not discussed, not negotiated, met. At Coutts & Co. they were, up to a point. Press reports at the time of her death in 2002 described her as overdrawn by around $4 million, though the bank never released any figure and the palace issued no official account of her finances. The Guardian, in March 2002, estimated her estate at $26 million, while acknowledging the trust fund arrangements that had probably contributed to the overdraft. What the biographers and the contemporaneous press established wasn't a precise number but a pattern. The spending, the resistance to any ceiling, and the arrangement that kept the system running regardless of the arithmetic. The Guardian noted that much of her wealth had come through inheritance, from her father, the Earl of Strathmore, and from her husband, and that the structure of her estate had created the liquidity problem that produced the overdraft. The money was there, technically, in forms that weren't immediately accessible, and so Coutts extended the credit, and the palace managed the arrangements, and life at Clarence House continued as it had always been intended to continue. The dynamic with her household staff followed the same lines. Multiple biographical accounts document that courtiers went to considerable lengths to avoid saying no to her directly. The specific phrasing matters. Not that they deferred to her wishes. They arranged their behavior in advance so the limit never reached her. Courtiers who needed to redirect her, slow her, redirect a plan she had fixed upon. They found other routes. They restructured the problem so she never encountered the refusal. The assumption that her wishes would prevail had become structural over decades, built into how the household operated at every level below her. Suggesting she might not have something she wanted wasn't merely impolitic. It simply wasn't done. The connection between this generation and the next surfaces in Andrew Loney's 2025 biography, entitled The Rise and Fall of the House of York, described by the BBC as an unrelentingly unflattering portrait. Loney reports that at some point after the Queen Mother's death, Andrew called a member of his household staff a King imbecile for failing to refer to his late grandmother by her correct title. The grandiosity of the offense, the certainty that the world owed a dead woman the proper honorific from every subordinate who mentioned her in passing, it reads like a scene from the generation Andrew had been raised inside. The specific words, the specific target, the specific grievance. A man in his 40s erupting at a servant because someone in his vicinity had referred to his late grandmother with insufficient formality. The Queen Mother had a household that went to elaborate lengths to keep limits out of her path. Her grandson, 40 years later, was still enforcing the same principle. Andrew Albert Christian Edward was born on 19th of February 1960. He was the third child of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, but the first born after the accession, nearly 10 years after Princess Anne, 12 years after Charles. Both elder siblings had been born to a woman who was still learning to be a queen consort rather than a queen regnant, a woman navigating a position she hadn't been raised for. Andrew arrived in 1960, a decade into the reign, to a mother who had found her footing on the throne and had more time for the child in front of her. Whether that translated into a particular preference for her second son is a claim the palace never confirmed. Every serious royal biographer has circled it without quite landing. El País described him as always considered Queen Elizabeth II's favorite son, linking this specifically to the timing of his birth. A child of a more stable era, raised by a more available mother. A Times columnist, writing in the period of his downfall, coined the phrase foolish maternal over-cosseting for the Queen's long pattern of shielding him from scrutiny, and called her his toxic enabler. Strong language for a newspaper not given to it about the sovereign. The royal biographer Robert Hardman offered what was, in its restraint, perhaps the most revealing formulation. She wasn't blind to his faults. The passive construction does considerable work. Seeing the faults and acting on them are different positions, and Hardman's careful phrasing suggested that the distance between those positions remained unclosed for decades. What hardened his public status into something near permanent was the spring and summer of 1982. Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands on 2nd April. Andrew was 22, a trained Royal Navy helicopter pilot, and there was internal debate. never resolved publicly, about whether the Queen's son should be kept from active combat. He went. He served with 820 Naval Air Squadron aboard HMS Invincible, flying Westland Sea King helicopters as pilot and co-pilot. His missions included anti-submarine warfare patrols in the carrier group's vicinity, search and rescue and casualty evacuation of survivors from damaged vessels, and operations in which the helicopters flew patterns designed to confuse or draw off Argentine Exocet anti-ship missiles. The risk was genuine and operational. He flew into a war zone while Argentine missiles were finding British ships. He came back from the Falklands, as BBC reporting would later describe, a changed man. El País put it plainly, his Falkland service briefly made him a national hero. The brevity is part of the story. The hero image lasted through the 1980s, long enough to give the palace something solid to point at whenever the tabloids turned their cameras elsewhere in the same direction. Randy Andy was a fixture of the popular press through that decade, a prince with a taste for models and actresses and a social life that generated regular copy. The relationship with actress Koo Stark caused diplomatic embarrassment after photographs from her film career resurfaced and was managed quietly. The press redirected, the palace declining comment until the story moved on. Sarah Ferguson's later financial and personal scandals in the 1990s were handled primarily as Sarah's problem rather than her ex-husband's, a clean separation in public framing that absorbed considerable institution effort. Andrew came through each episode as the Duke of York, with his rank intact and his access unquestioned. As a book published in the Epstein years would later observe, the royal family had sailed through these scandals relatively unscathed. It was true. Each time a scrape appeared, the protection held, the scrutiny passed, and Andrew remained Andrew. Nobody, across all those years, had tested the outer limit of the institution's capacity to protect him. Nobody had presented the palace with a problem it couldn't eventually outlast. That fact, the unbroken record of successful containment, was itself a kind of inheritance. The lesson available to a man who had watched his family absorb scandal after scandal without permanent cost was that the family always absorbed it. Always. Jeffrey Epstein entered Andrew's social world through Ghislaine Maxwell. Andrew's own account, given in the 2019 Newsnight interview, placed the introduction in 1999, with Maxwell, his close friend at the time, making the connection. A 2011 letter to the Times from Andrew's then private secretary Alistair Watson gave a different date. He described Andrew as having known Mr. Epstein since being introduced to him in the early 1990s. Those two accounts have never been reconciled. No publicly available photographs or contemporaneous records place Andrew and Epstein together before the year 2000. What the photographic record shows from 2000 onwards is a man fully embedded in Epstein's social world. That year, Andrew, Epstein, Maxwell, Donald Trump, and Melania Trump appeared together at a party at Mar-a-Lago, a photograph that entered the public domain and has remained there unchallenged. Also in 2000, Epstein and Maxwell attended the celebration at Windsor Castle, marking Andrew's 40th birthday, Princess Anne's 50th, and the Queen Mother's 100th. A man who would be convicted of sex crimes against a minor 8 years later was a named guest at a party held inside the home of the British sovereign for the most beloved woman in the family. The social geography of that evening has never been addressed by the palace. In July 2006, Epstein and Maxwell attended Princess Beatrice's 18th birthday party at Windsor Castle. In 2008, Epstein pleaded guilty in Florida State Court to 2 prostitution-related offenses, one involving a minor. He served approximately 13 months of an 18-month sentence, largely on work release, arrangements that allowed him to leave his facility and continue operating from his Palm Beach office during the day. A non-prosecution agreement with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Florida prevented federal sex trafficking charges and extended immunity to unnamed potential co-conspirators. Courts later found that victims had not been informed of this arrangement in advance, in violation of the Crime Victims' Rights Act. The deal became one of the most scrutinized prosecutorial decisions in modern American legal history, described in legal scholarship as the sweetheart deal of the century. Andrew issued a statement saying he was appalled by Epstein's alleged offenses and deplored the exploitation of any human being. In December 2010, Andrew flew to New York and spent approximately 4 days as a guest at Epstein's Manhattan townhouse on East 71st Street. The trip had been planned months in advance, beginning in April 2010, while Epstein was still under house arrest. Photographs entered the public record showing the two men walking together in Central Park on 5th December. Additional photographs showed Andrew standing in the doorway of the townhouse. Documents later released by the U.S. Department of Justice included emails in which Andrew, then serving as the UK's Special Representative for International Trade and Investment, forwarded what were described as confidential government trade mission reports to Epstein while in that official capacity. This material would subsequently form part of the basis for separate legal scrutiny of his conduct as trade envoy. In July 2011, after the Central Park photographs became sustained press criticism, Andrew resigned as trade envoy. Alistair Watson's letter to the Times, categorical, institutional, firm, drew the line in the sand. The insinuations were without foundation. Andrew had known Epstein since the early 1990s. The letter didn't explain what a man who had known a convicted sex offender for 15 or 20 years and continued visiting him in 2010 was doing in that position. It didn't need to. The palace had said what it needed to say. The press cycle moved. Virginia Giuffre, then Virginia Roberts, alleged in court filings from 2014 and 2015 that Epstein had trafficked her to Andrew on 3 occasions beginning when she was 17. At locations including Maxwell's London house, Epstein's New York residence, and his private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands. A photograph taken in March 2001 shows Andrew with his arm around Giuffre's waist, with Maxwell standing in the background. Andrew acknowledged in 2019 that the photograph was definitely him. He said he had absolutely no memory of meeting Giuffre. He has consistently and categorically denied her allegations. Buckingham Palace called those allegations categorically untrue and without foundation. For several years that held. Jeffrey Epstein was arrested in New York on federal sex trafficking charges in July 2019. He was found dead at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in August. The New York City medical examiner ruled the death a suicide by hanging. His social network, decades of connection to figures in finance, politics, and royalty, was thrown into intense and renewed public focus overnight. Andrew released a written statement acknowledging that the 2010 visit was a mistake and an error, that he had never saw, witnessed, or suspected criminal behavior, and that he had tremendous sympathy for Epstein's victims. Then he agreed to the interview. The BBC's Newsnight, presented by Emily Maitlis, recorded it at Buckingham Palace on 14 November 2019. It broadcast on BBC Two 2 days later, the 16th of November. The program ran 58 minutes. Andrew reportedly believed it would help clear his name. He had consulted advisors, one of whom resigned before the interview took place, apparently convinced it was a catastrophic idea. Andrew proceeded regardless. After the cameras stopped rolling, several accounts describe him giving Maitlis and the production team a tour of the palace. He was, by multiple accounts, pleased with how it had gone. The interview opened with Andrew explaining the trajectory of his relationship with Epstein, the 1999 introduction through Maxwell, the social appearances, the 2010 visit that he characterized as his attempt to end the friendship in person, because it was the right and honorable thing to do. Maitlis asked why, if the purpose was to end the friendship, he had stayed at the townhouse for 4 days rather than meeting Epstein briefly and leaving. Andrew said the location was convenient, a useful place to stay. He acknowledged that the decision was a mistake, but held to the position that the method, physically traveling to New York to end a relationship in person, as a house guest of the man being ended, was the ethical choice. I still don't, to this day, quite know why I stayed with him, he said, and then moved forward as though the admission required no particular examination. When Maitlis reached the specific allegations, she noted that Giuffre had described dancing with Andrew at the Tramp nightclub in London on the night of 10 March 2001, and that she had described him as profusely sweating during the encounter. Andrew's response entered the public record and remained there. He described a peculiar medical condition. "I have a peculiar medical condition, which is that I don't sweat, or I didn't sweat at the time." He attributed this to either a surplus or a paucity of adrenaline experienced during the Falklands War, which he said had left him no longer able to sweat, a condition he described as only recently beginning to reverse. Several doctors told the Times they didn't recognize this as medically plausible. Adrenaline surges produce sweating rather than suppress it, a temporary inability to sweat arising from combat stress, persisting for nearly 2 decades and then reversing, has no established precedent in medical literature. The medical term for inability to sweat is anhidrosis, a condition Andrew didn't use in the interview, describing the problem in lay terms while asserting its exculpatory power. Mateless would later describe the explanation as one of a series of pretty eccentric rationales in the interview, recalling that he had told her he wasn't able to sweat because of having had either a surplus or a paucity of adrenaline during the Falklands War. His alibi for $10 March 2001 was this: "I was with the children, and I'd taken Beatrice to a Pizza Express in Woking for a party." When Mateless asked why this memory was so specific when so many other memories of the period appeared to have failed him, Andrew explained, "Because going to Pizza Express in Woking is an unusual thing for me to do. A very unusual thing for me to do." A prince offering a Surrey chain restaurant as the alibi that would clear his name. The precision was intended to be exculpatory. To a substantial part of the watching audience, it landed differently. Precise alibis for specific dates 17 years in the past, offered by men who can't remember meeting a woman they were photographed with, belong to a particular category of explanation that the audience for criminal and royal coverage recognizes immediately. When Mateless asked whether Andrew had any guilt or regret about the friendship with Epstein, he described Epstein's behavior as unbecoming. She interrupted. "Unbecoming? He was a sex offender." Andrew continued. He called the 2010 visit a mistake, but maintained he was too honorable a person to have ended the friendship by telephone. He noted that the people he had met through Epstein and the opportunities to learn had been actually very useful. He pledged on camera that if asked, he would assist law enforcement. He expressed no visible distress about Epstein's victims at any point in the interview. He offered no unprompted sympathy. When challenged directly on the subject of empathy, he answered the technical question, could he have committed the act Jeffrey described, and moved on. His entire effect was of a man who had come to correct the record, not to account for something, to make it stop. The Guardian's assessment in the days following the broadcast described a grotesque mismatch between the Duke of York's language and demeanor and the gravity of the allegations which continued to surround him, between the obtuse self-absorption of a prince and what we know of the appalling sexual exploitation of teenage girls by his friend. The interview was characterized across the media as a car crash, as nuclear explosion level bad, as the worst royal public relations crisis since the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, in 1997, a benchmark that had held for over 2 decades as the outer limit of royal catastrophe. It now had competition. On 20th November, 4 days after the broadcast, Buckingham Palace announced Andrew was suspending public duties for the foreseeable future with the Queen's consent. The statement stressed that he sympathized with Epstein's victims. The institution had published in a press release the sympathy Andrew had visibly failed to express across 58 minutes of live television. By 24th November, he had stepped down from approximately 230 royal patronages. The accountancy firm KPMG announced it wouldn't renew its sponsorship of his Pitch Palace entrepreneurial scheme. Standard Chartered withdrew its support. The University of Huddersfield, of which he had been chancellor, accepted his resignation from that role. In January 2020, Jeffrey Berman, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, stated publicly that Andrew had provided zero cooperation with federal prosecutors and the FBI, despite the explicit pledge made in the interview that he would assist investigators if required. His representatives had not responded to approaches from the prosecution. The pledge, broadcast to millions of people, had not translated into a phone call. Virginia Giuffre filed her civil lawsuit against Andrew in the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York in August 2021. The case was titled Virginia L. Giuffre versus Prince Andrew, Duke of York, a.k.a. Andrew Albert Christian Edward, in his personal capacity. The allegations were sexual assault and intentional infliction of emotional distress, filed under New York's Child Victims Act. Andrew denied everything. His legal team filed motions to dismiss. On 11 January 2022, Judge Lewis Kaplan rejected those motions. The case would proceed. Depositions were scheduled. Medical evidence requests were filed. Giuffre's lawyers formally asked Andrew to supply documents related to his alleged inability to sweat and records of his trips on Epstein's aircraft. The prospect of Andrew giving sworn testimony under oath in a deposition that would be conducted by Giuffre's lawyers was now a concrete and imminent reality. 2 days after Judge Kaplan's ruling, on 13 January 2022, Buckingham Palace issued its statement. The Queen was 95 years old and still reigning. The announcement was made explicitly with the Queen's approval and agreement. The full text, as widely reproduced. The Duke of York's military affiliations and royal patronages have been returned to the Queen. The Duke of York will continue not to undertake any public duties and is defending this case as a private citizen. Every honorary military title was removed. Every military affiliation in the United Kingdom, Canada, and New Zealand was returned to the Crown. Every royal patronage was gone. Simultaneously, royal sources briefed journalists that Andrew would no longer use His Royal Highness in any official capacity, though he retained the designation privately. The formal written statement didn't contain those words. The restriction came through a separate channel of press briefings issued at the same moment. One message in print, another confirmed off the record, the institution managing both the official record and the actual communication simultaneously, because it had learned, across a century, exactly how to structure these announcements. The House of Commons Library's research briefing subsequently confirmed, in January 2022, it was announced that the now former Prince Andrew wouldn't use His Royal Highness in any official capacity. The family had navigated royal figures through consequence before, through the Stark years, the Fergie years, the first wave of Epstein headlines in 2011 when the private secretary's letter drew a firm line and the palace moved on. Through the decades of the Queen Mother's financial arrangements, which occasionally surfaced in the press and were never fully examined. Each time, the institution absorbed the problem and continued. The protection was institutional, reflexive, and reliable. January 2022 was different. The lawsuit was proceeding in a federal court. A deposition under oath was 6 weeks away. The Queen, at 95, in the last year of her reign, was signing off on the public stripping of her son's military rank. That isn't the action of an organization managing a problem inside its capacity. That is the action of an organization that had run out of capacity. On 15 February 2022, the parties informed the court a settlement had been reached. The case was subsequently dismissed without going to trial. No trial was held. Andrew admitted no liability. No court made any finding of guilt against him. The publicly reported joint statement said this: Andrew agreed to make a substantial donation to Giuffre's charitable organization supporting victims' rights. He stated he never intended to malign Ms. Giuffre's character. He accepted that she was an established victim of abuse who had faced unfair public attacks. He expressed regret for his association with Jeffrey Epstein and praised survivors' bravery. Settlement amounts weren't officially disclosed. Buckingham Palace offered no public comment on the settlement at all. The case is closed. That requires stating plainly, no court found Andrew guilty of anything. He settled without admitting the allegations, and the case was dismissed. Civil settlements resolve litigation. They don't constitute verdicts. What they do constitute, in this case, is the formal end of the protection that had held for most of his adult life. The Queen Mother died on 30th March 2002 at Royal Lodge in Windsor. She was 101 years old. 750,000 people queued at Westminster Hall to pay their respects as she lay in state, the queue stretching miles along the Thames in the March cold. The nation mourned her as a national treasure, the last human link to the wartime spirit that had defined British identity for a generation still living to remember it. In the year of her death, The Guardian estimated her estate at $26 million. The overdraft at Coutts was absorbed into the arrangements. The properties returned to the Crown or were distributed. The household was wound down. She had spent a century operating inside an institution that arranged itself to prevent anyone from placing a limit in her path. And she died having never quite encountered one that held. The courtiers had bent around her wishes for 50 years. The finances had been managed. The properties had been maintained. The bills had been met. The public who adored her saw the warmth and the wartime courage, and the gin and the racehorses and the hats, and they loved her for the image of cheerful indestructibility she projected, and forgave, or never examined, the quiet institutional architecture that made that image possible. She was beloved. She was untouched by the arithmetic beneath the surface. 2 generations later, the same institutional habit of protection met a different kind of problem. Prince Andrew was raised by the evidence of how his family operated across his entire life to believe that the institution would catch him. For most of his life, it did. It caught him through the Playboy years of the 1980s. It caught him through the first wave of Epstein coverage in 2011, when the palace secretary's letter to the Times drew the line, and the press cycle moved on. The pattern of successful containment was so consistent, so unbroken, across so many different kinds of scrape, that it had effectively become a fact about the world, a structural condition, like gravity. The institution would manage it. It always had. Then, on 16th of November 2019, he sat in a chair at Buckingham Palace across from Emily Maitlis, and for 58 minutes he explained, to a journalist who wasn't going to look away, that he had a peculiar medical condition, that he had been at a chain pizza restaurant in Surrey, that a 4-day stay at a convicted sex offender's home was simultaneously a mistake and the only honorable course of action available to him, and that he had no memory of ever meeting a woman he had been photographed with his arm around. He gave Maitlis and the production team a tour of the palace afterwards. He thought it had gone well. The institution couldn't absorb that, not because it stopped caring about him, because some scandals are simply larger than any family's reflex to absorb them, larger than the press briefing, larger than the carefully worded statement, larger than the private secretary's categorical letter to the Times. He lost the titles. He lost the patronages. He lost the public use of his rank. The lawsuit was settled for terms that, while carrying no admission of guilt, required him to accept in a published joint statement that Virginia Giuffre had suffered as a victim of abuse. The Queen, his mother, the woman whose biographers had spent years describing as his most consistent protector and his most consequential enabler, signed the order that stripped him of his military standing. She was 95, in the last year of her reign, and she signed it. The Queen Mother died beloved at 101 with the nation's grief and a trust fund, and 4 maintained properties in a Coutts overdraft that nobody fully excavated until after she was gone. Her grandson became the monarchy's gravest modern liability, stripped of the rank that had defined him, defending a civil lawsuit in his private capacity, settling terms he has never fully explained. The difference between them was never the entitlement. They both had it. The Queen Mother inherited it from the position. Andrew inherited it from the family. The difference was that one of them lived in an era that still looked away, that bent around the habit, absorbed the cost, arranged itself to keep the limit out of sight, and one of them lived in an era that had cameras and courts and a BBC journalist who sat across a table in Buckingham Palace and simply kept asking the question, if stories like this are what you're here for, subscribing keeps them coming.